Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 18 stories for you, including the listing of the sunken anchor, the sketch of the static guest, the knotted frequency, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The listing of the sunken anchor. Welcome to the Mariner's Rest, a charming, floating estate currently seeking its next permanent resident. This unique buoy tender offers an unparalleled maritime lifestyle, anchored eternally beside the rhythmic pulse of the Great Channel Marker. The upper deck is a masterpiece of nautical engineering, featuring a sun-drenched galley where one can brew coffee while watching the whitecaps dance. The main cabin provides a cozy sanctuary with wide windows that capture every nuance of the shifting tides. It is a perfect spot for a library or a quiet breakfast nook. Even the sleeping quarters upstairs are divine, offering a panoramic view of the horizon and a sense of vast, airy freedom. Every inch of this vessel has been curated to maximize light, warmth, and the steady, comforting lullaby of the waves against the hull. It is a home that breathes with the ocean, designed for those who find peace in the movement of the water. However, one must consider the basement, the deep hold beneath the floorboards where the cargo used to rest before we cleared it out for the modern buyer. Down here, the atmosphere shifts from airy to intimate. The air is thick and smells faintly of old cedar and salt-crusted iron. It is a functional space, perhaps best utilized as a storage room or a cellar, provided you do not spend too much time lingering in its corners during the long hours of solitude. Because while the upper decks are shared with the wind and the light, the basement belongs to something else. I discovered this during my first week aboard. At first, the song was just a hum, a low, vibrating note that seemed to resonate from the very keel of the boat. It only appears when you are completely alone in the hold. When I am upstairs, the boat is silent save for the water. But the moment I descend those narrow steps into the basement, the melody begins. It sounds like a cello played underwater, a weeping, melodic trill that rises and falls with the rhythm of my own breathing. On the third night, the song changed from a hum to a distinct, mournful tune. It was then that I noticed the draft. In the center of the basement stands a heavy oak door, slightly ajar. From behind it comes a constant stream of frigid air. This isn't just a breeze, it is a localized pocket of winter. When you stand in front of that door, the cold doesn't just hit your skin, it carves an impression into the air. It feels as though someone is standing there, perfectly still, holding their breath. The draft has a distinct shape. It is the exact outline of a person, roughly 5 feet tall, leaning slightly forward as if about to step into the room. You can feel its presence even when you cannot see its substance. One evening, while I was organizing some crates, the song reached a high, crystalline peak. The basement fell silent for 3 seconds, and then the draft moved. It didn't walk, it simply shifted 2 inches closer to me. The cold intensified, biting into my cheeks like a frost-covered thumb. I realized then that the entity wasn't just an outline of cold, it was a silhouette of intent. When the song returns to its steady pace, the draft remains anchored at the door, waiting for the moment I stop looking. Last night, as the channel marker blinked in a steady orange rhythm above us, I sat on a stool in the hold and closed my eyes. The song started a haunting, fluttering melody that felt like it was being played by invisible strings. I could feel the cold draft pressing against my shoulder, its outline sharp enough to make the hair on my arm stand up. It wasn't just standing anymore, it was leaning toward me, its icy perimeter tracing the curve of my head. I reached out a hand, half expecting to touch a shoulder or a face, but my fingers met only the biting, sharp air of a shape that refused to be solid. The song suddenly stopped, and for a heartbeat, the entire boat felt heavy with anticipation. Then, the draft didn't just move, it lunged forward, wrapping its frozen perimeter around my chest like a phantom embrace. I opened my eyes to find the basement plunged in shadow, the melody replaced by the sound of something solid finally exhaling. The sketch of the static guest. Fragment. The bus was a hum of vibration against the asphalt, until the engine gave its final, shuddering gasp. We were stranded at the Velvet Spoon, a roadside diner that looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself. It sat in the middle of a flat, desolate plain where the wind seemed to have more personality than the passengers. Illegible. I found a seat in the back corner, near a table littered with crumbs and a single piece of heavy cardstock paper. It was a child's drawing, a crude sketch of a mother, a father, and a small boy standing under a giant, weeping willow tree. The colors were muted, as if the crayon had been pressed hard into the pulp. Illegible. That night, as the rain began to drum against the glass, I noticed something strange about the drawing. A new figure had appeared. It was barely there, a faint outline of a tall woman with hair that seemed to flow like liquid silk over her shoulders. She stood behind the willow tree. I checked my surroundings. No one had moved from their seats. Illegible. The next morning, when we were served our coffee, the drawing changed again. Now, there was a dog at the boy's feet, its tail curved into a perfect crescent. I realized then that the drawing wasn't being edited by a human hand. It was growing. Every time I blinked or turned my head to listen to the rain, a new member of the family arrived. Illegible. By the second night, the tension in the diner shifted. The passengers stopped talking as much. They were watching the paper. On the third night, the drawing added a cat with ears like triangles, and then a very small bird perched on the mother's shoulder. Every time a new figure appeared, a subtle sensation washed over my skin, a prickly, electric warmth that made the fine hairs on my arms stand straight up. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical imprint. When I reached out to touch the paper, the hair on my forearm didn't just rise. It flattened into the distinct shape of a broad, heavy hand pressing against my skin from the inside out. Illegible. The drawing was becoming crowded. There was now a grandfather with a beard like moss, a pair of twins holding hands, and a strange, towering creature that looked like a bear made of stars. But as the family grew, the space on the paper began to shrink. The willow tree was losing its leaves to make room for the newcomers. Illegible. On the fifth night, a heavy silence fell over the diner. The bus driver sat at the counter, his head bowed. I looked at the drawing one last time before sleep took me. A new figure had appeared in the very center of the group. It was huge, a towering, humped shape that took up nearly half the paper. It didn't have a face, just a crown of jagged spikes and a body that seemed to ripple like water. As it appeared, the static charge intensified. The hair on my arms didn't just stand up this time. It surged outward until I could feel the pressure of 5 distinct points, a thumb, 3 fingers, and a palm pressing against my skin as if something were trying to push through from the other side. Illegible. I felt the phantom weight of it. It wasn't just a sketch anymore. The static charge hummed in my ears, a low-frequency vibration that sounded like a distant choir. I realized that the entity was no longer content to live on the paper. It had used every member of the family as a bridge to cross over into our world. Illegible. In the final hour before the bus engine finally roared back to life, the drawing underwent its last transformation. The willow tree vanished completely. All the figures, the mother, the father, the boy, the dog, the woman with silk hair, and the star bear, melted into a single pool of color at the bottom of the page. And standing above them, looming over the entire group, was a new figure, a giant, featureless face with a mouth wide open in a silent O. The static charge became a roar, and for one heartbeat, the hair on my arms didn't just mimic a hand. It vibrated so violently that I felt a cold, damp pressure actually touch my wrist. The bus started, the diner faded into the mist, and the drawing sat on the table, perfectly still. But as I looked down at my arm, I realized the imprint of the hand was still there, even though the paper was now empty. The knotted frequency. Incident report. Depot 9 Alpha. Subject, the audible knot. Date, day 42 of isolation. The last cargo ship vanished into the white haze 3 days ago, leaving me as the sole inhabitant of this corrugated iron shell in the middle of the tundra. Silence here is heavy. It isn't just the absence of sound, but a physical weight that presses against my eardrums. I was supposed to be alone for 48 hours before the relief team arrived, but on the first night, the radio began to hum. It wasn't the white noise of the wind or the crackle of static. It was a rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat skipping every fourth beat. I sat in the galley, cradling a tin mug of lukewarm coffee when the first word broke through. It didn't come from the speakers as much as it seemed to vibrate out of the very air. "Blue," it whispered. I froze. It wasn't a command. It was a recognition. My favorite color, the one my mother always told me made me look like a summer sky. There was no reason for the radio to know that. I checked the dials, but every frequency was empty except for that lingering vibration. By the second day, the voice became more coherent. It stopped offering single words and began to weave fragments of my internal life into its tapestry. "The smell of wet wool," it said during lunch. Then, the fear of a falling piano. It wasn't just recalling facts, it was pulling memories from the subconscious, things I hadn't thought about in years. Every time I tried to speak back, the voice would anticipate my next thought before I could form it into a sentence. On the third night, the physical presence manifested. I heard something moving behind the heavy storage crates, a sound of shifting tension, like a guitar string being tightened. Then, the entity emerged from the shadows of the corner. It was a bizarre construction of geometry and texture. It looked as though a sphere of raw, unformed clay had been wrapped in hundreds of thick, weathered rubber bands. These bands weren't just loose, they were knotted with intentional precision, creating a series of bulging protrusions and deep furrows across its body. It lacked a face in the traditional sense, but instead of features, it had clusters of small, circular knots that served as sensory pits. It didn't walk so much as it rippled forward. Each time I took a breath, the entity would flinch. If my inhale was deep, its rubber bands would cinch tighter, making its body shrink into a dense, compact lump. When I held my breath, it expanded, its surface tension groaning with a faint, squeaky sound of friction. "You remember the lighthouse? It spoke on the fourth day, its voice sounding like two stones grinding together." It was referencing a dream I had when I was 7 years old, a dream I had never told anyone. I found myself trembling as I realized the entity wasn't just observing me, it was consuming my history. By the 6th day, the radio began to scream with secrets. It spoke of the time I failed my final exams, the name of the dog I lost in 3rd grade, and the specific way I felt when I first saw the ocean. The entity moved closer every hour. It no longer stayed in the corner. It sat at the edge of my chair, its knotted body shivering with every pulse of my lungs. It seemed to be syncing its physical state to my biological rhythm. Tonight, the voice has become a constant stream of my own internal monologue, echoing back at me in a distorted pitch. "Why do you hide the ache in your left shoulder?" it asked. I looked at it, and for the first time, it moved toward me without me breathing. It reached out with a protrusion made of 3 interconnected knots that acted as a thumb. It touched my forehead. The rubber bands on its body tightened so fiercely that they began to hum. The radio erupted in a final, deafening crescendo of every secret I had ever kept, the ones I knew, the ones I felt, and the ones I hadn't even realized were there. It spoke my deepest, most private shame. You're afraid that you're being watched by something that knows exactly why. The entity pulled back slightly, its rubber bands relaxing just enough for me to see a new knot forming on its surface, a knot that hadn't been there before lunch. I realized then that it wasn't just reflecting my secrets, it was building itself out of them. I reached out to touch the cool, textured surface of the knots. As my fingers brushed against the rubber, the radio fell silent. The depot was perfectly still. The entity remained, poised and expectant, its body perfectly taut in anticipation of my next breath. I realized with a jolt that it wasn't just waiting for me to breathe, it was waiting for me to give it something new to remember. The smile of the shuttle. Sit close, Leo. The bus is humming, but don't let the rhythm fool you into thinking we are moving toward a destination. We have been looping this same stretch of Terminal 4 for what feels like hours, yet the clock on the dashboard has frozen at 3:14 a.m. There are no other passengers today. No businessmen with rolling suitcases, no exhausted travelers nursing lukewarm coffee. Just us and the silence that feels heavy enough to press against your eardrums. Listen to me carefully, because this is why we aren't looking out the windows at the luggage carters anymore. You must remember the rule I was told by my father, who was told by his before us. When the snow begins to fall on the floor of the shuttle, watch your feet. Every footprint you leave will be filled with white powder the moment you lift your heel. but the footprints leading back to your door will remain perfectly dry. Right now, look down at the carpet beneath your sneakers. See that? A thin layer of frost-white snow is accumulating, even though we are inside a pressurized cabin. It isn't falling from the ceiling, it is rising from the floor like dust from an old attic. But notice how the path behind us, the way back to our seat, is clear and crisp. The snow only gathers in front of us, claiming the ground as we move forward. And that brings us to the reason why we must stay seated until the very last second. Because something is sitting in the front row. It doesn't have a body in the traditional sense. It is more of a collection of textures and memories held together by an intent. It is the dimness. Imagine a shadow that has been soaked in ink, but instead of being flat, it has depth, like a deep well you could fall into if you reached out your hand. It doesn't have a face until it chooses to show you one. When it does, its most striking feature is its mouth, a wide, crescent grin that stretches from ear to ear. But the skin around those lips isn't just happy, it's hungry. In every tiny crease and wrinkle of that smile, a pocket of deep, velvety gloom pools like spilled oil. It doesn't just sit there, it pulses. The dimness is currently watching us, its grin fixed in a permanent state of amusement. It loves the snow because it can see where we have been. Every time I take a step forward to check the door, a fresh mound of white powder fills my heel print instantly. But when I look back at the seat where you are huddled, your path is perfectly dry, as if the dimness hasn't claimed those inches of floor yet. Don't let it see you blink, I whispered earlier, and I want you to remember that too. If you blink at the wrong time, the dimness will lean forward. It doesn't move with a fluid grace, it moves in jolts, like a film skipping frames. One moment it is at the front of the bus, and the next, it is halfway down the aisle, its grin widening. You can hear it, a faint, wet sound, like a sponge being squeezed, as the gloom in its smile ripples. It wants to know why we are moving so slowly. It wants to know why we aren't running. Is it coming closer? You asked me just now. I didn't answer because if I spoke, the dimness would feel my breath. Right now, it is sitting exactly 3 rows ahead of us. Its grin is wide enough to show a glimpse of its teeth, which look like smooth, rounded river stones, but the gloom in the creases of those lips is deepening. It's turning from a soft charcoal color into a bruised, midnight violet. The snow on the floor is rising higher now, reaching our ankles, but the path behind us remains a pristine, dry trail of history. We are moving toward the exit, the shuttle finally slowing as we approach the main gate. The dimness is standing up now. It isn't walking, it is gliding, its body swaying slightly like a reed in water. Its mouth opens wider, and for a second, I can see that the gloom in its smile isn't just a color, it's a tiny, swirling vortex of lost things. We're at the door now, Leo. The snow is nearly up to our knees. I am reaching for the handle, but before we step out into the light of the terminal, we have to acknowledge it one last time. It has reached the very edge of our seat. Its grin is stretched so wide that the corners of its mouth are almost touching its cheeks, and the dimness in those folds is glowing with a faint, rhythmic throb. I am going to open the door now. We will step out, and the snow will vanish into the carpet of the terminal. We will be safe in the light where it cannot follow us easily. But as we step onto the solid ground, the dimness will remain on the shuttle, its grin frozen in that perfect, hungry curve. I can still feel it watching me from the front row, waiting for the next time the snow begins to fall. The echo in the water tower. The first note was stuck to the refrigerator door in my father's shaky, cursive script. It read, "I found something on the roof tonight." I figured he meant a loose brick or perhaps a bird's nest. But as the heat of the July evening pressed against the windows, making the air inside the house feel thick and syrupy, I realized the notes were changing. The second note was on the hallway mirror, written in his handwriting, but slightly more hurried. It lives in the water tower. By the third note, taped to my bedroom door, his hand had become remarkably steady, almost precise. It knows we are watching it. The rooftop water tower loomed over our backyard like a rusted iron crown. It was an old thing, a massive cylinder of corrugated metal that hummed when the wind caught it. That night, the humidity felt heavy enough to drown in. I climbed the spiraling metal stairs with my father, his boots clanging against the iron. He didn't speak much, He just pointed upward at the great dome of the tower. At the very peak, nestled inside the crown-like rim, sat a creature that looked like a tangle of wet silk and polished mahogany wood. It had no face in the traditional sense, but rather a series of iridescent, overlapping scales that shifted like oil on water. Instead of limbs, it had 4 weeping ribbons of velvet flesh that trailed behind it as it moved. As we reached the platform, my father stood perfectly still. The creature didn't move at all. It simply existed, its body pulsing with a soft, rhythmic amber glow. It was a beautiful thing, yet there was something deeply wrong about its silence. Every time I tried to speak, the air felt as if it were being sucked into the creature's core. I took a deep breath and started to say, "It looks like silk." The creature chirped. I hadn't even fully formed the thought in my mind before the word escaped its mouth, or rather, from the space between us. It wasn't an echo. It was a preemptive strike on my consciousness. I blinked, confused. I tried again, focusing my mental energy on the next description. The scales are burning. It finished me before I could finish myself. It was as if the creature was reading the blueprint of my thoughts before the house could build the walls. My father watched it with a strange, hungry expression. He wasn't looking at the creature. He was watching how the creature reacted to us. We sat there for an hour in the sweltering heat. The water tower seemed to groan under the weight of the humid air. I began to feel a strange pressure behind my eyes, as if my brain were being squeezed by invisible hands. Do you think it hunts? I felt a jolt of electricity skip down my spine. It was getting faster now. The gap between my thought and its utterance was shrinking until they almost collided in the middle. It feels like home. My father finally spoke, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. It isn't just finishing your words, he whispered. It is stealing them before you have the chance to own them. I looked at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to ask if it was lonely, but the creature beat me to it. Is it lonely? The creature pulsed a deep, bruised purple. The ribbons of velvet flesh swayed, though there was no breeze. Then, something happened that made my breath catch in my throat. My father reached out a hand, and for a moment, he didn't move at all. He just stared at the creature with wide, watery eyes. I wonder if you. It wasn't just a word. It was an observation. The creature had predicted that I would wonder about it, but it also predicted that my father would be the one to voice the connection. But then, the creature did something truly unsettling. It didn't wait for me to think of its next action. It simply mimicked the sound of a human sigh, perfectly pitched to my own internal rhythm. I stood up to leave, my legs feeling heavy like leaden weights. The heat was becoming unbearable. I turned to my father and said, "Let's go." Down. We descended the stairs in a daze. The silence of the night felt different now, no longer empty, but full of the creature's potential thoughts. We reached the ground and walked into the kitchen. My father sat at the table, his face pale in the moonlight. He picked up a piece of paper and wrote one final note on the back of the last one. "It is inside us now." I looked at my father, wanting to ask him what he meant by inside. I wanted to know if it was in our blood or our bones. Is it me? Before the word could fully leave my lips, I felt a sharp, cold tug at the back of my skull. My father didn't answer. He just smiled, and for a split second, his eyes flashed with that same iridescent, oil-slick shimmer. I realized then that the creature hadn't just been watching us, it had been practicing being us, and now that we were standing in the kitchen, it was beginning to take over my internal monologue entirely. I opened my mouth to say good night, but before the thought could even flicker into existence, the creature, now hidden inside my own head, spoke for me, always. The Lexicon of the Lull. In this valley, we do not call it sleep. We call it the surrender. To say you are sleeping is to imply a passive state, but here, survival depends on your awareness. When the wind farm turbines groan and pivot, casting their rhythmic shadows across the service shed, my job is to maintain the gears. But my real job is to remain awake. The locals tell me that if you surrender for more than 3 heartbeats without intent, the weaver will find you. I first encountered it during the great gale of November. The wind was a low morning cello note vibrating through the steel masts outside. Inside the shed, The air smelled of grease and wet wool. I sat on my stool, clutching a wrench, watching the massive blades turn. "Do not let your eyelids heavy," my mentor had whispered before he vanished into the archives of the lower valley. "Because once they close fully, you are no longer just resting, you are being harvested." At first, I thought it was a metaphor for the monotony of maintenance. But then came the first night of the deep frost. The wind died down to a rhythmic pulse, and the hum of the turbines became a steady thrum. My eyes began to droop. Just as my lashes touched, I heard it, a sound like wet silk being pulled through a sieve. It was coming from the rafters. I forced my eyes open. There, hanging from a rusted beam, was the weaver. It did not have a face in the traditional sense. Its body was a dense, matted nest of human hair, golden strands, wiry black locks, and fleecy white tufts all braided together with silver thread. Instead of skin, its torso was a mosaic of fingernails, thousands of them, arranged in concentric circles like the scales of a fish. It didn't have a mouth. It had a jagged seam where a mouth should be, lined with tiny, serrated bits of keratin. It didn't move at first. It just hung there, swaying slightly. Then it began to grow. As I watched, the weaver extended a limb made entirely of braided hair and elongated nails, reaching toward my shoulder. "Stay awake," I whispered to myself, my voice cracking in the silence. The entity moved with a strange, fluid grace. It didn't walk, it rippled. It was stitching itself into the very fabric of the shed. It began to pull out small strands of hair from its own body and weave them into the wood of the walls. I realized then that it wasn't just moving through the room, it was consuming the space between being awake and being asleep. As my exhaustion mounted, the weaver grew more frantic. It began to hum, a vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into my bones. Every time my eyelids drifted shut, the weaver would lunge forward, its nail scales clicking like 1,000 tiny teeth. It was hungry for the transition. It wanted the exact moment your consciousness slips from the shore of reality into the ocean of dreams. I felt a cold pressure on my brow. The weaver had reached out and touched my forehead with a cluster of blunt, ivory nails. It wasn't just feeling my skin, it was tasting my thoughts. I saw its body ripple as it absorbed a fragment of my memory, the taste of an apple from 3 years ago, and turned that memory into a new knot of hair on its chest. I fought the heaviness in my limbs. I gripped the edge of my workbench until my knuckles went white. The wind outside began to howl again, but inside, it was almost silent except for the click-clack of the weaver's body expanding. It had moved from the rafters to the floor now, sprawling out like a tangled rug of hair and bone tips. "Just one more minute," I pleaded. My vision blurred. The edges of the shed seemed to melt into the texture of the weaver's body. The ceiling became hairy. The floor became polished by fingernails. It was weaving my environment into its own physical form, turning the shed into a nest of discarded parts. I felt the ultimate weight of the surrender pulling at me. My head tilted back. The weaver rose up, towering over me, its hair body fanning out like a heavy cloak. It hovered inches from my face, the 1,000 nails on its chest vibrating in a frantic rhythm. I could see the individual strands of hair, each one belonging to someone who had finally given in. I forced my eyes wide. I commanded my brain to stay in the light. The weaver paused, its movement suspended as if it were holding its breath. It hovered there for an eternity, a shimmering mass of texture and shadow, waiting for me to blink. Finally, with a monumental effort of will, I snapped my eyes open and remained conscious until the sun broke over the horizon. The weaver didn't vanish. It simply folded itself into the corner of the shed, becoming a heap of dull hair and muted nails. When I finally stood up to leave, I noticed something on the floor near my feet. It was a single, perfect strand of hair, glowing with a faint, pearlescent sheen. I reached down to touch it, but stopped when I felt the weaver's nail scales twitch in the corner. I realized then that while I had won the battle for today, the weaver was still there, waiting for the inevitable moment my strength fails, and I finally offer myself to the stitches. The Molt of the Whispering Tide. In our village, we do not use the word memory because a memory is a thing you own. We call it echoate. It is the heavy sediment of what happened, pressing against your ribs until you can no longer breathe easily. We do not say home either. We call it the anchor. A home is where your shadow feels most comfortable resting. And when the tide comes in to swallow our sea stack, we do not call it solitude. We call it the narrowing. Because on a sea stack, there is no room for anything but what remains of you. I sat upon that limestone spine as the salt spray coated my skin like a second layer of sweat. The water was rising, carving the world away until only the rock and I existed. In my lap lay the radio, its copper dial oxidized by the brine. It shouldn't have worked here, yet it hummed with a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated against my thighs. Then, through the static of the narrowing, came the first voice. It wasn't a human voice, not entirely. It sounded like wet velvet being pulled across sandpaper. You were afraid of the way your mother looked at you when you broke the porcelain vase. The radio crackled. I froze. The wind died for a heartbeat. Nobody was on the stack but me. I hadn't spoken her name in years, and I had never told anyone about that specific, simmering guilt. Then came another sound, a soft, rhythmic thump slide. It was the sound of something moving behind me, not walking, but peeling. From the shadow of the jagged peak above, it emerged. It was not a man, nor a ghost. It was a creature of iridescent scales that shifted from copper to bruised plum. Its body was segmented like an insect's, and its face featured 3 vertical slits instead of a nose or mouth, each vibrating with a hum. It didn't have hair. Instead, a mane of stiff, translucent bristles fanned out from its crown. As it moved toward me, it shed a layer of its outer skin, a brittle, hollow shell that fell to the whetstone with a musical ring. It stood in the center of the rock and let out a sharp hiss of satisfaction. The radio spoke again, its voice growing clearer, more intimate. You keep your secrets in the cellar of your mind, but I am hungry for them. It moved toward me, its heavy tail dragging behind it, leaving a trail of shimmering slime. With every step it took across the sea stack, it molted again. From my perspective, it was as if the creature were shedding its very presence into the environment. Behind it, each room, or rather, each pocket of space it occupied, was filled with a hollow copy of itself. These copies weren't solid, they were porcelain-thin husks of its previous shape, frozen in the exact posture it held at the moment of molting. I watched as 3 shells now stood around me, their scales dull and matte compared to the vibrant creature moving toward my chest. I felt a surge of echo weight. I remembered the secret I hadn't even told myself yet, the way I had secretly wished for the silence of the sea more than the noise of the land. The creature stopped an inch from my face. Its 3 slits flared open, exhaling a mist that smelled of ozone and old parchment. "You want to be forgotten," it whispered into my mind through the radio's hum. "But you're the only one who can hear the peeling." It reached out with a limb that had 4 joints and ended in a wide, flat pad rather than a claw. It touched my forehead. As it did, I felt my own skin begin to tighten, becoming brittle. The tide roared higher, nearly reaching my knees, but I didn't move. The creature began its final molt, spinning in a circle as the sea stack shuddered. It threw off its entire outer body in one violent motion, leaving behind a perfect, hollow statue of itself that captured every ripple of its movement. The creature was now smaller, more compact, and intensely bright, glowing with an inner light like a trapped ember. It didn't leave me. It didn't disappear into the waves. It simply settled onto my shoulder, its weight familiar and comforting. The radio gave one final, long burst of static. Before the voice returned, barely a breath now. Now we are both part of the same shape. The tide reached its peak, drenching the rock in a roar of foam. I closed my eyes, feeling the creature's shell press against my neck like a collar. When the water finally retreated and left me standing on the high point of the stack, the silence was absolute. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer smooth skin. They had become slightly segmented, and my pulse felt less like a beat and more like a hum. The creature was still there, nestled in the crook of my neck, its 3 slits vibrating in perfect unison with my own heart. It opened one slit and spoke, not through the radio this time, but directly into my ear. "Don't worry," it whispered. "The next layer will be your turn." I looked at the hollow shell it had left behind on the ground, and realized that while it was still standing there, it wasn't just a statue. Its empty eye sockets were now tracking my every movement, as if it were waiting for me to crack. The pulse of the hallway. Pass me that recorder, Elias. My hands are still a bit shaky, but I want to get this down before the memory turns into dust. It was the night of the great grid failure. The city went dead as if someone had simply exhaled and turned out every lamp at once. I was stationed at the Municipal Crisis Hotline, tucked away in a basement room that smelled of old paper and ozone. Most people expect horror to be loud, but during a blackout, the silence is what carries the weight. It makes you notice the tiny things, like the way my chair squeaked, or the way the breathing of the other operators felt like heavy velvet draped over our shoulders. I remember it clearly. We were mid-shift when the lights flickered and died. The transition wasn't instant. It was a slow fading of the world until we were submerged in a thick, pressurized ink. I sat there for a moment, my headset still pressed against my ear, listening to the sudden absence of the hum of electricity. Then, from the hallway just outside our door, came the sound. It wasn't a footfall. It was a wet, rhythmic thrumming. Asterisk thump shhh. Thump shhh. Asterisk like a heavy fruit being dropped into a pool of syrup. I stood up, my joints popping in the stillness. Is someone there? I asked. My voice felt thin, like a piece of thread stretched too tight. No one answered from the hallway, but the thrumming grew more insistent. It was joined by a strange, melodic vibration of a low-frequency hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. I walked toward the door, my hand hovering over the brass handle. The air felt heavier here, warmer, as if someone had been exhaling into the corridor just seconds before I arrived. I pulled the door open. The hallway was a tunnel of shadow, but right in front of me sat a rocking chair. It wasn't ours. It hadn't been there when we started our shift. It was made of dark, polished oak, and it was moving back and forth with a steady, hypnotic cadence. Asterisk, creak swish. Creak swish, asterisk, I blinked, trying to reconcile the sight with the fact that no one was sitting in it. It moved as if it were being pushed by an invisible hand, or perhaps swaying in a breeze that only existed in that small patch of floor. I took a step back into the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. That's when I felt it, the pressure change. The air suddenly felt crowded. From the far end of the hallway, something began to emerge. It wasn't a ghost or a man, it was a grub. A massive, segmented creature, about as wide as the hallway itself and nearly as long. Its body was composed of overlapping plates of iridescent chitin, shifting from deep copper to a bruised plum color. It didn't have legs. It moved by rippling its entire mass forward in undulating waves. But the most unsettling part was how it reacted to me. As it crested into the doorway, it stopped. It didn't have eyes to see me, yet it seemed to sense my presence with every fiber of its being. It began to pulse. Each segment of its body flared outward, and a series of tiny, translucent cilia, like thousands of microscopic eyelashes, rippled across its back. Then, the sound changed. The wet thrumming became faster, synchronizing perfectly with the rhythm of my own heart. I realized then that it wasn't just moving toward me, it was reacting to me. It mistook my pulse for a call. It was a mate seeker, and I was its intended partner in the dark. The grub arched its segmented body upward, tilting its massive front section toward my chest. It let out a sound like a wet flute being blown underwater, a long, bubbling trill of recognition. I froze. I knew that if I moved too quickly, it would lunge. I could feel the heat radiating from its chitinous skin, a humid warmth that smelled of damp earth and crushed mint. It moved closer, the tip of its head nudging my shoulder with a gentle, inquisitive pressure. It was trying to find the source of the beat. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity, its entire body vibrating in sympathy with my chest. I could feel the tiny cilia brushing against my skin, searching for the exact point where my life force flickered. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the grub pulled back. It didn't retreat into the shadows. It simply settled onto the floor, its segments relaxing until it lay flat like a fallen ribbon of armor. The rocking chair stopped mid-swing, perfectly still, as if the invisible hand had let go. I breathed out, a long sigh of relief escaping my lungs. I reached out and touched the wood of the chair, then the cool, hard shell of the creature's flank. I sat back down in my own chair, watching it rest. The silence returned, but it was different now, heavier, more intimate. I realized that while the grub had found its mate in me, I would never truly be alone in that room again. Even when the lights came back on and the city roared to life, I knew what was waiting just beyond the door. I reached out to grab my pen to make a note, but my hand stopped halfway. The grub hadn't quite finished its task. As I sat there, I felt a tiny, rhythmic twitch against my ribs from inside my own chest cavity. It wasn't just mimicking my heart anymore. It had left a small piece of itself behind, and now, every time I breathed, I could feel that tiny, chitinous pulse thrumming against my lungs. The Autocomplete of the Void. Patient Observation Log. Ground Station 09. Subject, the Operator. Observations by Nurse Alara. Shift 1 began with a sense of mechanical serenity. The satellite dish, a massive iron bloom pointing toward the velvet void of the cosmos, hummed with a low-frequency vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of my bones. I sat before the primary terminal, the glass screen glowing like a portal into the deep dark. My task was simple: interpret the data streams and feed them into the predictive linguistic engine. This software was designed to finish thoughts, to take a fragment of human intent and auto-complete it into a full, coherent sentence based on cosmic patterns. At first, it worked beautifully. I typed the stars are, and it finished with silent witnesses. It felt like poetry. By hour 3, however, the rhythm changed. The input field began to pulse with a faint, amber warmth. I typed, the signal is steady. The engine responded, and hungry for your attention. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keys. I hadn't meant to add the second half. The software was supposed to follow my direct cues. But as I watched, a new word appeared in the bracketed completion: waiting. It felt less like a calculation and more like an observation. By hour 6, the hum of the dish grew heavier, vibrating against my chest cavity. The temperature in the room dropped, yet the screen began to radiate a palpable heat. I typed, the dish rotates slowly. The engine responded, but your breath catches in your throat. My heart skipped. I hadn't felt my breath catch. It had been perfectly steady. The predictive text was beginning to anticipate the physical sensations of the room rather than the logic of the sentence. Then came the first visual anomaly. A smudge appeared on the interior of the glass. It wasn't a speck of dust or a stray drop of oil. It was a hazy, blurred patch of moisture, as if someone had pressed a wet palm against the screen from the inside. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. The smudge moved slightly to the left. It looked like a fingerprint, but wider, the mark of an entire face leaning into the surface. I typed, the screen is clear. The engine responded, except for the place where we lean against it. I felt a prickle of sweat on my neck. The warmth from the glass was no longer uniform. It was concentrated in 3 distinct spots, mirroring the location of those fingerprints. I could see them now, the slight ridges of skin pressing outward, making the screen bulge slightly like a bubble of water about to burst. They weren't just marks, they were tactile impressions. When I moved my hand toward the glass, the warmth surged, and the smudge rippled as if reacting to my proximity. By hour 9, the linguistic engine began to lose its patience with my input. It started finishing sentences before I could even finish the first word. I typed, it is, and it finished, closer than you think. I didn't type anything for a full minute. The cursor blinked, a steady heartbeat in the gloom. Then, without my touch, a new line appeared. Do not look at the curve of my cheek. That was when I saw it. Not a shape, but a texture. A patch of skin, mottled with the color of bruised plums and toasted almonds, was pressed firmly against the inner surface of the monitor. It wasn't a face in the traditional sense. It lacked a nose or a distinct chin. Instead, it looked like a soft, fleshy continent of wrinkles and pores, stretched wide to fill the frame. I could see the individual grains of skin, each one slightly flattened by the pressure of whatever was pushing from the other side. I typed, "Are you?" and it finished. Trying to escape? The fingerprints began to shift. The entity didn't just sit there, it shifted its weight. I heard a faint, wet sound, a squelch of skin against glass. A new set of marks appeared near the top of the screen, looking like the heavy press of a forehead. I felt the air in the room thicken, smelling faintly of ozone and old rain. My hands were shaking. Now, I decided to be bold. I typed, "Tell me your name." The engine took a long beat, the cursor dancing erratically. Then it completed. It is easier if you don't speak it aloud. I felt a sudden, sharp heat on my cheek, the literal warmth of its face pressing through the glass to touch mine. It was so close that I could see the microscopic hairs on its skin standing up. The screen wasn't just a display anymore, it was a membrane. And as I watched, the entity pushed its entire face forward, the fingerprints spreading until they covered nearly half the monitor, leaving me with no room to breathe. I typed, "Why are you here?" The engine finished with a finality that made the dish above us groan in sympathy, "Because you gave me the words to exist." I sat perfectly still as the entity pulled back just an inch, leaving behind a trail of damp, warm streaks. I reached out and touched one of its fingerprints, feeling the slight lingering heat of a cheek that had been resting against my world for hours. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was full of the weight of something watching from just behind the surface. I looked at the blank screen one last time before I dared to turn off the power. A final, tiny bit of text appeared in the center, without me typing a single letter. "Wait for the next sentence." The light died, but as I sat in the dark, I could still feel its forehead resting against my own. The Inch of Winter. The house sits in the throat of an old-growth grove, a place where the trees are so ancient and thick that they have swallowed the sky. From my porch, looking out into the timber, I can never see the sun. There is only the velvet green of needles and the heavy, damp weight of bark. But it wasn't just the density of the woods that haunted me, it was the progression. Every winter, as the frost settled into the moss, the tree-line moved. It didn't just grow taller or wider, it crept forward toward my porch like a slow-motion tide of wood and thorn. The pines advanced by exactly 3 feet each year, claiming the yard, then the grass, then the very air I breathed. It began as a sensory ghost. On the first night of the deepest frost, I felt it before I saw it. The temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted in a localized circle around my rocking chair. It was a sharp, biting cold that tasted of iron and wet stone. Then came the smell, a heavy, loamy scent of crushed fern and old, stagnant water, like a forest floor that had been held underwater for a century. I sat there, shivering, watching the shadow of the nearest pine reach out toward my feet. It felt as though something was exhaling against my neck, a steady breath that lacked the warmth of lungs. Then came the second night, and the nights began to braid together into a single, unending cycle of anticipation. The smell deepened, shifting from wet earth to something more pungent, the scent of bruised pine needles and toasted cinnamon. I noticed the ground where the tree-line had moved was no longer just dirt, it was being pressed down by something invisible. Small indentations appeared in the frost, like heavy footprints that didn't belong to a boot or a hoof. They were deep, oval pits that seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic vibration. I found myself whispering into the dark, my voice feeling small against the towering canopy. "Are you closer today?" I asked. The only reply was the sudden drop in temperature, a wave of cold that made the hair on my arms stand rigid. By the middle of the month, the tree-line had reached the edge of the porch steps. It didn't just sit there, it seemed to lean inward. I started to see the physical manifestations of the entity. It wasn't a solid creature of flesh and bone at first, but a distortion in the air. It looked like shimmering silk pulled taut over a sphere, rippling with the texture of lichen. When it moved, it didn't glide, it hummed. A low, vibrating frequency that rattled the floorboards beneath my feet. I spent those nights watching it emerge from the shadows of the trunk. It had no face in the traditional sense, but rather a surface of undulating ridges like a walnut shell, covered in fine, velvet-like fuzz. When it moved closer, the smell became overwhelming, a suffocating perfume of ancient sap and ozone. It didn't have limbs so much as sweeping ribbons of texture that trailed behind it like the tail of a comet made of moss. One night, the tree-line reached the very first step. I sat perfectly still as the temperature plunged until my breath came out in thick plumes of white mist. The smell was sharp enough to sting my nose, a mix of wet wool and crushed mint. Then it emerged from the wood fully. It stood before me, a towering mass of woven textures, looking like a tapestry that had been knitted by a giant hand. It didn't have eyes to see me, yet I felt its attention. It reached out with a ribbon of soft, serrated texture and touched my shoulder. It wasn't cold like ice, it was cold like a mountain spring in January. The sensation sent a jolt through my spine. It didn't move with the grace of an animal, it moved with the deliberate weight of a falling curtain. It hovered there, its lichen fuzz shimmering under the moonlight. "Stay," I whispered, my voice trembling. The entity responded by pulsing. The ridges on its body shifted, creating a sound like grinding stones. Then it did something that broke the rhythm of the woods. It leaned forward, its velvet surface pressing against mine, and for a moment, the smell of old water was replaced by the scent of a single, dying rose. It stayed there until the moon reached its zenith, a heavy presence that made the porch feel small and crowded. I realized then that it wasn't just visiting, it was claiming. It had moved from the forest to my doorstep, and now it was moving into my space. The tree-lean hadn't just grown, it had traveled. In the morning, I woke up in the chair with a deep frost on my sleeve and the scent of pine still clinging to my hair. The entity was gone from the porch, but the forest felt different. It felt smaller. And as I looked out at the yard, I realized that while it had moved inward by 3 feet, the trees behind it had closed the gap perfectly, erasing the ground where it had once stood. I walked out into the garden and noticed something on the floorboards of the porch. A single, perfect indentation remained where its heavy mass had rested, but there was also a new trail of frost that didn't melt by noon. I looked back at the tree-lean, which now sat just inches from my feet. It wasn't waiting for next winter to move again. It had simply decided that the porch was no longer enough. I heard a soft hum from behind me and realized that even though the entity was invisible in the daylight, its weight was now pressing against my back, following me into the house. The recipe of the still water. My grandmother's kitchen always smelled of rosemary and old paper, but it was her handwritten cookbook that held the true secret of our lineage. On the very last page, past the heavy creams and the roasted meats, sat a solitary recipe titled The Soufflé of the Submerged Quarry. It wasn't just a set of instructions for baking, it was a manual for survival in the sunken stone pits of our valley. At the bottom, buried in tiny, cramped handwriting, were the footnotes that mattered most. When the quarry floods at dusk, do not let the diver stare too long into the window of the submerged cottage. For when the water rises to meet the glass, the reflection will wake. It does not mimic you, it anticipates you. It performs your life a heartbeat before you live it. I had spent my youth laughing at these notes, thinking they were mere whimsy until the day I took my turn as the sole diver in the flooded quarry. The water was a bruised purple, thick with silt and silence. As the sun dipped low, casting long, distorted shadows across the jagged limestone walls, I swam toward the center of the pit. There, standing amidst the weeds like a tombstone, was the cottage, a small, stone structure almost entirely swallowed by the deep water. Its single window faced me, a square of clarity in the murky gloom. As I kicked my fins, a strange sensation prickled my skin. It was as if the water itself were leaning in to listen to my heartbeat. I reached the cottage and hovered before the glass. The interior was dry, though the outside world pressed against it with weight. That was when the moths appeared. They didn't fly so much as they swarmed, thousands of velvet-winged creatures clinging to the exterior of the single window. They were heavy enough to make the glass groan under their collective weight. They clustered in a thick, pulsating carpet, their wings shivering like tiny hearts. My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind, never open the window. I took a breath and pressed my palm against the pane. The moths shifted, a wave of dust-colored fur rippling over the glass. Suddenly, I saw it inside the cottage. At first, it looked like a trick of the light, a shape seated in a high-backed chair. But as I moved my hand to the left, the shape moved its right hand to the left a fraction of a second before I did. It was a ripple in time rather than a simple mimicry. The entity wasn't a ghost or a twin. It was an echo that lived in the immediate future. When I blinked, it had already opened its eyes. When I exhaled a bubble of air, it had already finished its breath and was beginning to inhale. It possessed a texture like wet silk pulled over smooth river stones, with a face composed of soft, overlapping scales that shifted color from moss green to deep copper. Its ears were tufted like a lynx's, and its mouth was a wide, permanent curve of contentment. I felt a surge of curiosity override my caution. I reached out to touch the entity's face, but as my fingers moved forward, it had already tilted its chin upward to meet them. It didn't wait for me to arrive. It prepared for my arrival before I even knew it was coming. The more I moved, the more frantic the timing became. If I raised an eyebrow, it had already narrowed its own. If I took a step forward in the water, it had already planted its feet firmly on the floor of the cottage. The moths began to scream, a high-pitched, collective hum that vibrated through the glass. They were sensing the tension. The entity began to lean forward, its body stretching toward the pain. It wasn't just reacting anymore, it was beginning to lead me. I found myself moving in a strange, rhythmic dance with it. I would swing my arm, and a half-second later, the entity's arm would whip through the air like a trailing ribbon. It felt as though we were two dancers sharing a single soul, separated by a thin sheet of glass and a tiny fracture in time. Then, the water shifted. A low groan vibrated from the quarry floor, and a small tremor sent a ripple through the surface. The cottage swayed. In that moment of instability, I felt an overwhelming urge to do what the footnotes forbade. My hand gripped the latch. The entity's hand grasped its own handle. For a heartbeat, we were perfectly synchronized. I pulled the window open. The sound was like a long-held sigh escaping a pair of lungs. The moths erupted into the air, spinning like confetti in the twilight. And there, the entity didn't wait for me to reach it. It surged forward through the opening before my hand could fully clear the frame. It didn't just move, it occupied the space I was about to inhabit. It landed on the wet grass of the cottage floor with a soft thud, its scales shimmering in the fading light. It looked up at me, its face full of recognition. Because it had lived my movements before I did, it seemed to know exactly how I felt in that very moment, a mixture of awe and terror. I reached out to touch its head, but as my fingers moved, it already leaned into the contact, closing its eyes before my skin actually met its brow. I stayed there for a long time, watching it breathe in the rhythm of my own lungs. The water continued to lap against the stone walls, and the moths settled onto the grass like fallen stars. I realized then that the entity wasn't just a reflection. It was my own destiny, playing out one heartbeat ahead of my awareness. I finally turned to swim back toward the surface, but as I began to kick, I felt a sudden tug on my heel. I looked down to see the entity had stepped out of the cottage and into the water, its hand reaching out to catch me before I even realized I was falling. The receipt of the Unspooling guest. The mountain air at 3 a.m. is thin enough to taste like cold copper. You sit alone in the high-altitude observatory, the massive brass telescope pointing toward a cluster of stars that feel heavy with secrets. The only sound is the rhythmic hum of the cooling system and your own breath hitching in the silence. Then, the first sound comes from above, a metallic rattle in the ventilation shaft. It isn't just noise, it's a vibration that makes the hair on your arms stand up. You lean back in your chair, expecting a gust of wind or a shifting floorboard, but instead, a voice drifts down from the ceiling. It is dry and textured, like sandpaper rubbing against silk. "You are going to reach for your coffee mug now," it says. The voice doesn't echo. It feels as though it is being spoken directly into your inner ear. You freeze, your hand hovering inches away from the ceramic cup. You don't move until the voice confirms, and you will find that it is slightly colder than you expected. You blink, and your fingers close around the handle. The porcelain is indeed chilled. A prickle of unease crawls up your spine. From the vent directly above your head, a faint sound begins, a rhythmic clicking, like an old typewriter operating underwater. You will look at the telescope now, the voice narrates. You lift your gaze to the great lens, and as you do, a thin strip of paper begins to emerge from the grate in the ceiling. It isn't just falling, it is unspooling with purpose. It looks like a long, continuous receipt, but instead of ink on paper, it features tiny, delicate engravings of textures and shapes. As the paper falls, a new part of the entity manifests at the end of the strip. With every inch of paper that drops, an inch of the creature grows out of the very tip of the roll. It isn't a solid body yet. It is a sequence of textures emerging from a void. You watch as a coil of iridescent scales appears, then a patch of velvety moss, followed by a section of smooth, polished horn. The voice continues its steady narration. You will notice how the creature grows with every word I speak. As you watch, the paper unspools faster. A curved limb shoots out, covered in tiny golden beads that clink against one another like miniature bells. It isn't a humanoid shape. It is a chaotic, beautiful progression of biological wonders. The creature is printing itself into existence, unfolding from the ceiling like a floral ribbon of meat and shell. You feel your heart hammer against your ribs. Every time you blink, more of it appears. A section of translucent membrane ripples, then a cluster of soft feathers that shimmer with a pearlescent sheen. It begins to hang down, swaying slightly in the draft. You will feel the urge to stand up, the voice commands. You find yourself pushing your chair back, the legs scraping against the stone floor. And you will realize that I am not just describing your movements, I are creating the space for them. The creature is now 3 feet long, a trailing tail of mismatched textures, scales, fur, silk, and bone hanging from the vent like a royal train. It doesn't have a face yet, only a series of sensory pits that pulse with a faint, rhythmic light. You stand in the center of the room, paralyzed by the sheer strangeness of its geometry. The voice grows louder, more resonant, vibrating in your chest cavity. You will take a step forward. You move, and as your foot hits the floor, another 6 inches of the creature print out. This time, it produces a wide, fan-like wing made of stiff bristles that smell faintly of crushed mint. The paper is unspooling so rapidly now that it sounds like a waterfall of parchment hitting the floor. The creature is no longer just hanging. It is beginning to weave itself into the air. It has grown a series of rotating joints, like the hinges of a clockwork toy, allowing it to curl around the telescope's frame. You will feel my weight, the voice whispers. You can see it now, the physical presence of the entity pressing against the air. It is heavy, dense with the minerals of its own printing. It has developed a series of weeping eyes that aren't eyes at all, but tiny spheres of polished amber that catch the starlight. The creature begins to pull itself down from the ceiling, using its various textures as anchors. The scales grip the stone, the feathers sweep the dust, and the velvety moss absorbs the moisture in the air. You are no longer just watching a narration, you are hosting an unveiling. You will reach out your hand, it says, and your arm moves involuntarily, guided by the voice. Your fingers meet something cool and pebbled. It is the creature's main body, a dense, knotted mass of every texture it has printed so far. It feels like a piece of ancient driftwood wrapped in satin. The unspooling hasn't stopped. Even though you are standing still, the receipt continues to pour out of the vent, piling up on the floor like drifts of snow. Each new inch brings a new mystery. A section of cork-like skin, a row of tiny humming teeth, a tuft of glowing filaments that spark when they touch your skin. The voice reaches a crescendo, becoming a chorus of overlapping tones. You will see my face. At the very tip of the unspooling ribbon, the final inch prints out. It is a singular, perfectly smooth sphere of deep violet hue, centered with a single crack that glows with an inner light. The creature stops printing. The movement ceases. The silence that follows is heavier than the noise was. The entity is fully manifest, draped over the telescope like a sprawling, textured tapestry of impossible biology. You are left standing in the center of the observatory, your hand still resting on its velvet-soft flank. The voice gives one final, quiet instruction. You will realize that I am only printing what you are about to see. Then, from the violet sphere at the end of the ribbon, a tiny, sharp needle of bone pokes out and gently touches your forehead. You realize then that it wasn't just describing your life, it was preparing to replace it. The muted guest. I stood before the townspeople of Oakhaven, my hands trembling against the mahogany lectern. It was a humid Tuesday, and the prairies stretched out beyond our village like an endless, golden sea of grass. Above us, the great water tower, a rusted, iron giant with peeling orange paint, loomed over the horizon. I was there to deliver the eulogy for my grandfather, a man who had lived a life of sturdy silence. He was a man of few words, I began, my voice echoing slightly against the metal hull of the tower. But when he spoke, the world seemed to lean in to listen. I paused, looking at the crowd. In the front row sat my cousins, my aunts, and the local neighbors. We were all there to celebrate a life well lived, yet as I looked out, I felt that familiar, nagging prickle on my neck. It was the sensation of being watched by something just slightly outside our focus. I turned to the large photograph pinned to the easel, a group portrait taken during the Harvest Festival 3 years ago. There were 22 people in the frame. Everyone knew who they were: the baker, the schoolteacher, my grieving mother, and my father. But there was one more figure standing at the very back, partially obscured by a hanging garland of dried corn. It was a person-shaped silence, a shape that didn't seem to belong to any human soul. I had noticed it in every photo we took since the summer it first appeared. It always stood in the background, its body composed of a dense, velvet texture like moss grown over stone. It didn't have hair. Instead, its head was crowned with small, crystalline protrusions that hummed when it moved. He died peacefully in his sleep, I said, trying to maintain my flow. But as the word peacefully left my lips, a strange phenomenon occurred. The nearest neighbors, the ones within arm's reach of me, suddenly lost the ability to hear their own breathing. A pocket of absolute silence expanded from the back of the crowd. And there it was. The entity stepped forward from behind the easel. It didn't walk so much as glide, its body absorbing the very vibrations of the air. It looked like a tall, sturdy pear carved from deep mahogany wood with skin that rippled like water. Actually, I corrected myself instinctively, my voice sounding muffled. He died in a sudden, frantic rush. As I spoke, the entity leaned toward me. A soft thrum vibrated in the air, the sound of it drinking the word frantic. The entity didn't have a mouth in the traditional sense. Instead, its face featured a series of vertical slits that pulsed. When it drew in my voice, the sound didn't just vanish, it was swallowed, leaving a vacuum behind. The crowd gasped, but their gasps were half-eaten by the entity's proximity. I looked back at the photograph and then at the creature. It had moved into the center of our circle now. It was drinking the atmosphere. Every time I tried to describe his life, it would lean in and sip a piece of my sentence like a traveler drinking from a well. He loved the smell of rain, I said. The entity drifted closer. Slurp. The sound of my voice vanished into its velvet chest. It left me with only the feeling of having spoken. He was a master gardener. I tried again. The entity moved to my right side, pulling in the word master. Now, the neighbors within reach of it were moving their lips in total silence, their voices being harvested before they could travel more than an inch from their teeth. It was a hungry sort of quiet. Its crystalline crown caught the light of the setting sun, glowing with a dull, amber heat. I felt a surge of irritation. This thing, this guest in every photo, was devouring my eulogy. I realized then that it wasn't just standing there, it was collecting us. It had been in our photos for years because it was slowly consuming the history of our village, one sound at a time. He lived to be 92, I announced. The entity searched forward, its mahogany skin rippling as it drank the numbers. By the time I reached the end of my speech, there was almost nothing left to hear. In conclusion, I whispered, "He will be missed." The entity moved directly in front of me, occupying my personal space completely. It leaned its head forward until its crystalline crown touched my forehead. It didn't just drink the word mist, it drank the very air I used to exhale it. The prairie went silent. The wind stopped. Even the distant rustle of the grass died away, as if the entity had reached out and pulled a blanket over the entire world. I stood there, my mouth open, the final sentiment of my grandfather's life held in my throat like a trapped butterfly. I looked at the creature, its vertical slits pulsing with the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. It wasn't just a person-shaped quiet, it was a vacuum of existence. I realized then that when I finally finished the eulogy, there would be no one left to hear the ending because the entity had already eaten the beginning. The crowd began to move away, their faces expressions of serene, muted confusion. They didn't need to speak. They had felt the silence it provided. But as I turned to walk back to my seat, I noticed something on the floor where the entity had been standing. It left a small, physical deposit, a tiny, solid bead of pure sound that looked like a marble of glass. I reached down to pick it up, but before my fingers could touch it, the entity did something unexpected. It didn't just sit there. It turned its face toward me and widened its slits. The small bead of sound, the final remains of my grandfather's name, was sucked into its chest with a tiny melodic pop. I stood alone in the center of the village square, the orange water tower casting a long shadow over the grass. I looked at the empty space where the creature had been. It was gone, retreating back into the shadows of the rusted tower to wait for the next noise to arrive. I realized then that the entity wasn't just drinking my words, it was waiting for me to make more, so it could have something else to eat. The rhythm of the recycled breath. I moved into the apartment on a Tuesday, but it wasn't until Friday that I decided to tackle the spare room. It was a narrow rectangle of space, choked with cardboard boxes left behind by the previous tenant. Some were sealed tight with yellow tape, while others sat agape like hungry mouths, revealing glimpses of old sweaters, heavy books, and cracked ceramics. In the center of this labyrinth sat a single rocking chair made of dark, weathered oak. It was sturdy enough to withstand a gale, yet it sat perfectly still when I first pushed the door open. The air in the room felt thick, as if the oxygen had been sitting in those boxes for years, waiting for someone to disturb it. I spent the afternoon sorting through a large crate near the window. Every time I pulled an item out, a rusted key, a porcelain thimble, a fraying ribbon, I found myself glancing at that rocking chair. It remained motionless, a silent sentinel amidst the clutter. However, as the sun began to dip, casting long, amber shadows across the floorboards, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. A soft sound emerged. Asterisk creak. Sway, asterisk the chair was moving. There was no breeze from the window, and I hadn't touched it. It moved with a rhythmic consistency, tilting forward and back at a pace that felt deliberate. I stood up, my heart fluttering against my ribs. "Who's there?" I whispered to the empty room. The chair didn't stop. It continued its steady motion, carving an invisible path through the dust of the boxes. I walked toward it, my socks muffling my footsteps on the wood. As I reached out to touch the armrest, I realized something peculiar. It wasn't just moving, it was reacting to me. When I inhaled deeply, the chair rocked forward. When I exhaled, it swayed back. It felt as though the furniture were mimicking my own lungs, mirroring the expansion of my chest. I sat down on the edge of a nearby box and watched it for 10 minutes. The synchronization was perfect. Every time my ribs expanded, the oak seat dipped. Every time I let out a puff of air, the chair settled back into its center point. It was almost comforting, a mechanical heartbeat for the room. But then, as the shadows deepened into charcoal, the sensation changed. I took a deep breath and held it, waiting for the chair to hold its position. Instead, the chair continued to rock forward, even though my lungs were still full of air. That was when the first prickle of unease crawled up my spine. My breathing had stopped, but the chair kept moving. I realized then that it wasn't just mimicking me, it was sampling me. It took my rhythm and held onto it like a borrowed garment. I stood up quickly, my breath hitching in my throat. The chair did not stop. It continued its slow, steady sway, as if it were still inhaling the air I had provided moments before. I decided to leave the room for a moment to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. I wanted to see if the motion would persist without my presence in the room at all. I pulled the door shut, but through the gap at the bottom, I could still hear it. Asterisk creak. Sway, asterisk it was steady, tireless. When I returned 5 minutes later, the chair was rocking even faster than before. The rhythm had shifted from a calm walk to a hurried jog. And then I saw it. Just above the seat of the chair, something began to manifest. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, no floating sheet or glowing orb. Instead, it was a shimmering distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. It had the texture of crushed velvet and the color of bruised plums. It didn't have a face, but it had a shape, a rounded, bulbous head that sat atop a torso made of undulating ripples. As I watched, it opened a wide, petal-like mouth, and let out a long, audible exhale. It was perfectly in sync with the rocking chair. The entity was breathing for me now, using my own discarded rhythm to animate its velvet body. It moved with a strange, fluid grace, its ripples flowing like water over stones. Every time it exhaled, a faint mist of violet vapor escaped its mouth. I felt a sudden urge to match it again. I took a breath in, out, and the entity responded instantly, its ripples tightening and loosening in perfect harmony with my own ribs. But as I stood there, mesmerized by its velvet texture and its steady pulse, the room grew colder. The sound of the rocking chair began to change. It wasn't just a creak anymore. It was a wet, sliding sound, like leather rubbing against silk. The entity moved from the seat of the chair, rising into the air above it. It hovered there, suspended by nothing, its petal mouth fluttering. I realized then that it wasn't just mimicking my breath to be artistic, it was consuming it. Every time I inhaled, the room felt a little emptier, as if the entity were drinking the oxygen from my lungs and storing it in its velvet body. By the time I reached out to touch the shimmering surface of its skin, my chest felt heavy, almost hollow. I took one final, deep breath, a conscious effort to fill my lungs to capacity. The entity lunged forward, its petal mouth stretching wide as it inhaled with a violent, hungry suction. It drank my air so completely that I was left gasping for a second. Then, the rocking chair gave one final, violent lurch and came to a complete stop. The entity settled back onto the seat of the oak chair, its velvet ripples smoothing out until it looked like a resting stone. The room fell into a heavy, profound silence. I stood in the doorway, my own breath shallow and trembling. I realized that for the next hour, I wouldn't need to breathe at all. The entity would carry my rhythm for me. I retreated to my bedroom, but as I lay in the dark, I could hear it from the other side of the door. The chair was still, the entity was still, but I could hear the sound of something wet and velvet moving against the wood. Then, from behind the door, came a long, steady exhale that belonged to me, yet was coming from the room where I no longer stood. The ink of the unspoken. I have always preferred the quiet work of staging a home. It is a solitary craft, rearranging furniture to mimic a life that hasn't happened yet. This Saturday, I was tasked with prepping a Victorian duplex on Willow Lane for an open house the following morning. The weather had been humid, leaving the air thick and smelling of damp earth. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the floorboards, I realized I was the only soul in the house. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. I had spent hours placing cushions on the velvet sofas and arranging ceramic vases on the mantelpieces. By 6 o'clock, the light turned a bruised purple, and I decided to take a brief rest in the kitchen before the final walkthrough. I stepped into the hallway and noticed something peculiar on the hardwood floor. A single wet footprint sat near the baseboard of the heavy oak front door. It was distinct, a perfect arch of moisture, as if a heel had pressed firmly into the wood. I blinked, thinking perhaps a leak had sprung from above, but there was no water dripping from the ceiling. Then I saw another. And another. A trail of wet footprints began to emerge from that locked front door, snaking across the floor toward the center of the living room. The strange thing was that the door had been bolted shut since I first entered the house an hour ago. There were no pets, no children, and no guests. I walked toward the trail, my own footsteps sounding hollow in the emptiness. Each print was slightly different in size, becoming larger as they moved away from the door. They weren't just random splashes, they were deliberate marks of weight. I reached out to touch one, feeling the slight chill of moisture against my skin. Then I noticed a scrap of paper lying near the largest footprint. It was a small piece of parchment, and on it was a single word written in a script that made my heart skip a beat. "Welcome," it read. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was mine. Not just similar to mine, but an exact twin of my own cursive, down to the slight curl at the end of the W and the way the E leaned slightly to the left. I frowned, looking back at the front door. It remained locked. I hadn't signed anything yet, and I hadn't placed any labels on the furniture. A sense of unease began to prickle at the back of my neck. I moved further into the house, following the trail as it veered toward the dining area. More scraps of paper appeared, scattered like fallen petals along the path. Each one bore a different word or phrase in my own hand. Stay, listen, observe. By the time I reached the kitchen island, the footprints had formed a wide circle around me. The moisture was still fresh, glistening under the dim glow of the chandelier. I felt a presence, not a physical weight, but a shift in the atmosphere, as if the room were holding its breath. From the shadows of the corner, a figure began to coalesce. It wasn't a ghost or a solid person, but a shimmering distortion of ink and texture. It looked like a smudge of charcoal and wet paint suspended in the air. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its surface was covered in shifting lines of my own handwriting, moving like tiny worms burrowing through silk. It moved toward me with a fluid, jerking motion, leaving tiny droplets of black ink behind it. I stood frozen as it hovered just inches from my chest. It didn't speak, but the texture of its body seemed to hum. Suddenly, it extended a limb, a stroke of thick, dark calligraphy, and touched the side of my face. At that exact moment, another piece of paper fluttered from the ceiling and landed in my palm. I looked down at it. The script was mine, perfectly formed, forgive. Who are you? I whispered, my voice cracking in the still air. The entity pulsed. A new line of text rippled across its torso like a heartbeat, the one who remembers. I took a step back, and the footprints behind me began to move. They weren't just sitting there anymore. They were migrating toward the kitchen, as if the moisture was flowing like a slow-moving river. I realized then that the entity wasn't just mimicking my handwriting, it was stealing my intentions. Every time I thought of a word, it etched it into existence before I could say it aloud. I reached out to touch its center, and as my finger met the ink, a jolt of cold electricity surged through my arm. The room suddenly filled with the sound of scratching, the sound of 1,000 pens moving across paper at once. The entity expanded, its body stretching until it covered the walls, turning the entire kitchen into a scroll of my own thoughts and memories. I saw phrases I had never consciously written: the hunger, the waiting, the ink. I grabbed a chair and pulled it toward me, feeling the ground tremble slightly. The entity drifted closer, its handwriting becoming more frantic, more jagged. It began to sign things in the air around me, marking the space with my own identity. It signed the air above my head, and I realized then that the entity wasn't a visitor. It was a byproduct of my own mind manifesting in the physical world. It was the sum total of everything I had ever written, every note taken, and every letter drafted, finally finding a body to inhabit. The moisture from the footprints began to seep into the floorboards, turning them dark and heavy. I reached out one last time, my hand trembling. Is it finished? I asked. The entity drifted forward until its ink-stained surface touched my forehead. It didn't move for a long moment, then produced one final, perfectly curved stroke of ink on the very tip of my nose. The house fell into a profound, heavy silence. The footprints stopped moving. The walls ceased their frantic scratching. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, watching the last bit of moisture evaporate from the floor. I realized that while it had finished signing the room, it hadn't quite finished with me. As I stood up to leave, the entity didn't vanish. It simply retreated into the shadow of the pantry, becoming a permanent resident of the house. I walked to the front door and reached for the handle, but before my hand could touch the brass, I felt a tiny prick on my palm. I looked down to see a single drop of black ink had fallen from the ceiling, perfectly shaped like a period at the end of a sentence. The Cartography of the Hollow Shells. If you find yourself tasked with mapping the sunken veins of the Deep Reach mine, you must approach it not as a geologist, but as a survivor. The mine is a labyrinth of flooded limestone, where water hangs heavy and silent, reflecting the jagged teeth of the ceiling. I spent 3 years charting its depths alongside Elias, our guide, until the day we realized that some things in the dark are better left unmeasured. To survive the mapping process, you must first learn to distinguish between the stone and the pulse. The mine is alive, but it does not breathe, it waits. By the 2nd year, we noticed the peculiar behavior of the sediment. It didn't just settle, it drifted toward the center of every chamber as if pulled by an invisible magnet. This was our first clue that something moved through the water when we were not looking. The entity, we eventually named it the Weaver, does not possess a solid skeleton. Instead, it is composed of a shimmering, iridescent membrane that ripples like oil on a puddle. It has 3 pairs of translucent wings that resemble dragonfly wings, but are textured like hammered copper, and a face dominated by a singular, vertical slit instead of a nose or mouth. Its most striking feature is the way it moves. It doesn't walk so much as it flows, leaving a trail of glowing phosphorus in its wake. The Weaver possesses a unique biological quirk. Every time it enters a new chamber, it molts. It sheds its outermost layer of skin, leaving behind a perfectly hollow, porcelain-like shell of itself. These shells are rigid and capture the exact posture of the Weaver at that moment. In our first month, we found only one shell in the Great Hall, a perfect replica of a creature leaning forward as if sniffing a rose. By the 3rd month, there were dozens. They littered the floor like discarded porcelain vases, each one a frozen snapshot of movement. The horror began when we realized the shells weren't just decorations, they were memories. As we moved deeper into the flooded tunnels, the Weaver began to follow us with predatory grace. It would glide through the water behind our backs, and every time it crossed into a new cavern, we would hear a distinct clink, the sound of its new skin hitting the floor. We started to notice that the shells were not identical. The one in the entrance hall was tall and reaching. The shell in the whispering gallery was curled inward as if shivering. But then came the day of the Great Molt. We entered the central vault, a massive cavern where the water was barely an inch deep. The Weaver emerged from a side tunnel, its iridescent membrane pulsing with a soft violet light. It moved toward us, its copper wings buzzing like a distant cello string. Just as it reached the center of the vault, it shuddered. A wet, tearing sound echoed through the chamber. Its current skin split down the middle and peeled away in one continuous motion, landing on the stone floor with a heavy thud. The new skin was smaller, more compact, and perfectly still. It stood there, an empty vessel of shimmering glass, while the Weaver itself, now slightly larger and more vibrant, slipped out from inside the shell like a snake leaving its cocoon. We realized then that the Weaver wasn't just shedding, it was accumulating. It was building a gallery of its own history. We spent weeks cataloging the shells, numbering them by room. But as we prepared to leave, a new sensation took hold of us. The silence of the mine began to feel heavy, weighted by the presence of the Weaver's past. When we finally reached the surface and returned to our village, the mine remained behind, but its influence followed us home. We built a house near the mouth of the cave, and that is where the real observation began. Every winter, as the frost bit into the wood of our porch, we noticed the tree lean at the edge of the wood shifting. It wasn't just growing, it was migrating. The pine trees seemed to lean toward the house, their needles pointing inward. But as we looked closer, we saw that they weren't just leaning, they were being pushed by something beneath the soil. One night, after a heavy snowfall, I stepped onto the porch and saw the first shell of the Weaver sitting on the top step. It hadn't walked there, it had been deposited. The next week, 2 shells appeared. By the end of the month, the entire porch was littered with porcelain replicas. They were all different. Some were upright, some were sprawling, some were curled into tight spheres. I sat in my chair and watched them for hours. Then, one evening, I heard the wet, rhythmic pulse of movement coming from inside the house. The Weaver had entered our living room. It didn't make a sound as it glided over the rug, its copper wings shimmering in the candlelight. It moved toward the center of the room and stopped. With a violent, melodic crack, it shut its skin once more. I watched as the iridescent membrane peeled back to reveal a new, smaller shell, one that was perfectly shaped like a human sitting in a chair, with one arm raised as if reaching for a phantom cup. The Weaver then pulled itself out of that shell and moved toward the kitchen. By morning, there were 3 shells in the living room, the old ones from the mine, the one from the porch, and the new one from the night before. We lived in peace for a year, but every winter, the treeline crept another foot closer to our front door, as if the forest itself was trying to reach out and touch the shells. Now, we know the rule of the Weaver. It leaves behind what it used to be so that it can become what it is next. Last night, I woke up to a sound in the hallway, a soft, dragging friction against the floorboards. I opened my bedroom door and saw the weaver standing in the doorway. It wasn't molting this time. It was simply waiting. It stood there for an hour, its copper wings vibrating so fast they became a blur. Finally, it moved forward into my bed and began to peel. When the shell fell away, it revealed a hollow interior that looked exactly like a human ribcage, but instead of a heart, there was a small, pulsing knot of violet light. The weaver then stepped out of its new shell and stood over me while I slept. It didn't move for 3 hours. When I finally opened my eyes, the creature was gone, having retreated into the shadows of the corner. But when I looked at the shell it had just left behind on my pillow, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The hollow shell wasn't shaped like a bird or a strange beast anymore. It was perfectly shaped like my own face, frozen in an expression of eternal surprise. The geometry of the ceiling. I was supposed to be the only human presence in the north barn for 48 hours, tasked with monitoring the first heavy lambing of the spring. The air inside was thick with the scent of sweet clover and warm wool, a comforting perfume that usually numbed the isolation of rural life. However, as the sun dipped below the horizon on the second night, the familiar geometry of the barn began to betray me. I sat on a sturdy wooden stool in the center of the loft, watching the newborn lambs settle into the hay. At first, it was a subtle thing, a microscopic adjustment of my surroundings. Every time I blinked, the heavy oak table across from me seemed to migrate an inch to the left. When I opened my eyes again, it was no longer perfectly parallel to the barn wall. It didn't glide smoothly, it jumped, as if snapping into a new position in the fraction of a second my eyelids were shut. I tried to tell myself it was an optical illusion caused by the flickering lantern, but then the stool beneath me shifted 2 inches toward the hay bales. Is the floor moving? I whispered to the empty space, my voice swallowed by the rafters. The barn didn't answer, but the furniture responded with a dull, wooden thud that vibrated through the soles of my boots. By midnight, the shifts became more aggressive. The table had moved so far it was now nearly touching my knees, and the stool had rotated 45 degrees. I realized then that the furniture wasn't just moving, it was reacting to something. It was as if the room were a stage being rearranged by an invisible director who only performed during the moments of human sensory deprivation. The silence of the barn became heavy, weighted with the knowledge that something was watching. I heard it then, a wet, rhythmic clicking sound emanating from above. It wasn't the steady drip of rain or the muffled bleat of a lamb. It was the sound of something navigating the rafters. When I finally looked up, my breath hitched in my throat. The entity was not on the floor or hanging from the beams like a common bat. It moved along the undersides of the ceiling joists as if gravity were merely a suggestion it chose to ignore. It possessed a segmented body reminiscent of a polished beetle, but with the supple grace of a ribbon. Its skin was a deep, iridescent bronze, textured with tiny, overlapping scales that caught the lantern light like hammered copper. Instead of legs, it had dozens of small, jointed protrusions that acted as anchors, allowing it to glide over the timber with a mesmerizing fluidity. It didn't crawl so much as it flowed, its body rippling in waves from head to tail. I watched it for an hour, paralyzed by the spectacle of its movement. It moved like a weaver's shuttle, darting from one end of the barn to the other, its bronze shell humming with a low-frequency vibration that I could feel in my teeth. Each time it passed over me, the furniture below would lurch violently. The table would slam into a new position. The stool would spin like a top. It was clear now. The entity was walking on the ceiling, and its weight, or perhaps its intent, was pulling the ground-level objects along with it in a magnetic tether. Then came the moment of true unease. I stopped trying to ignore the shifting furniture and decided to confront the creature. I reached out my hand toward the nearest beam, expecting the entity to dart away as if startled by my gaze. Instead, it paused. It hung upside down directly above my head, its bronze scales shimmering. From its underside emerged a cluster of sensory filaments, soft, translucent threads that swayed in the still air like sea anemones. These filaments didn't just touch the wood, they seemed to taste the very atmosphere around me. I held my breath, afraid that even a single exhale might break the spell of its concentration. It began to descend, not by falling, but by extending these filaments downward. They reached out like thirsty roots, seeking purchase in the air between the ceiling and my face. As they touched my skin, the furniture below underwent a final, frantic reorganization. The table slid toward me until it was mere inches from my chest, and the stool pulled into its shadow. The entity hung there, perfectly suspended, its bronze body curving into a crescent shape. It wasn't just moving the furniture, it was sculpting the room to accommodate itself. I felt the filaments brush against my forehead, then my cheeks. They were cool, like damp silk. I could hear the clicking of its internal gears, a tiny, metallic ticking that sounded like a clock wound too tight. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity, vibrating with a soft intensity. Then, with a sudden, decisive motion, it pulled itself upward, snapping back against the ceiling as if it had been released from a spring. The furniture settled instantly into its final arrangement. The barn fell into a profound, ringing silence. I sat there in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, watching the bronze shape above me. It didn't move for a long time. Then, with a sound like a soft intake of breath, it began to glide again toward the far corner. As it moved, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The furniture hadn't just moved closer to me, it had rearranged itself into a perfect semicircle around my seated position, as if preparing for an audience. And then, with one final blink of my eyes, I felt the table shift again, not toward me, but slightly inward, tilting its top just enough to create a small depression in the center where my head rested. I realized then that it wasn't just rearranging the room for itself. It was preparing a throne for me. The entity turned its bronze body one last time, facing downward, and I saw the tiny, pulsing core at its center begin to glow with a faint, sickly green light. It didn't want to be the only thing in the barn. It wanted to witness my reaction to the change. I stood up slowly, my joints creaking in the quiet air. The stool stayed perfectly still for the first time all night. I took one step forward, and the entire table slid toward me with a smooth, silent grace, settling into place like a loyal hound. Every piece of furniture in the barn was now oriented toward that single spot where I stood. The entity began to move again, but this time it didn't just glide along the ceiling. It started to spiral inward toward my head, its bronze scales clinking against one another. It moved faster and faster, a blur of copper light, until it was hovering just above my crown. I closed my eyes, expecting the feeling of its weight to press down on me, but there was nothing but air. When I opened them, the entity had vanished from the ceiling entirely. I looked around, confused, searching for its bronze shell. It wasn't in the rafters anymore. It wasn't on the beams. I looked down at my feet and realized that it hadn't disappeared. It had simply moved to the one place I hadn't checked. The entity was now perched perfectly still on top of my own head, its tiny filaments brushing against my hair, waiting for me to realize that while I had been watching it move the furniture, it had been moving me, too. The Banquet of the Bent Silver. I never intended to stay in the basement for more than a weekend, but the house above me was beginning to groan under its own weight. My grandfather had built this ranch in the 50s, and beneath its floorboards lay a fallout shelter, a concrete womb designed to keep us alive when the sky turned to ash. It felt like an architectural secret, tucked away from the wind and the noise of the neighborhood. For the first 3 days, it was peaceful. The air tasted of lime and old dust, and the silence was thick enough to touch. I spent my hours reading by a single hanging bulb, content with the hum of the ventilation shaft that breathed like a rhythmic lung. On the 4th night, the static began. It wasn't just background noise. It was a textured, grainy hiss that seemed to leak from the very pores of the concrete walls. At first, it was faint, a white noise drizzle that settled in the corners of the room. But as I sat at the heavy oak table my grandfather had hauled down there, the static began to sharpen. It stopped being a hum and started becoming a texture of sound, like sand rubbing against velvet. Then, the voices emerged. They weren't screams or clear sentences at first. They were fragments of conversation, layered over one another like whispers in a crowded theater where everyone was trying to speak at once. "He is settling into the chair now," one voice murmured, smooth as polished river stone. "Yes," replied another, its tone slightly raspy. "The posture is correct." Do you think he knows we are watching? I froze, my book halfway open. The voices didn't belong to me, and they weren't coming from a radio. They were coming from the air itself. And then I heard them discuss me specifically. He prefers the blue sweater today. I looked down at my sleeves. I was wearing a navy wool knit. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then came the first guest. From the center of the empty oak table, a sound of metallic scraping echoed. A sharp clink shhh. A pile of cutlery appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't just a fork or a spoon. It was a heap of silver and steel that looked as though it had been crushed by a giant thumb. The pieces were bent into organic, almost muscular shapes. There were heavy spoons with bowls deep enough to hold a secret, and forks with tines curved inward like the teeth of a predatory fish. Most strangely, they weren't just lying there. They were arranged in a perfect circle, as if they had tumbled out of a pocket and settled into a deliberate formation. I blinked, and I realized there was one extra place setting at the table. A plate of porcelain, 3 bent spoons, and a fork that curved like a question mark. It sat perfectly opposite my own. "It is hungry for the texture," the voices whispered in unison. On the 5th night, the static grew louder, vibrating the water in my glass until ripples danced on the surface. The voices became more opinionated, their personalities sharpening like a blade. "The fork prefers the curve of the left," one voice complained. "It is impatient for the meat," another sighed. And then, the second setting appeared. With a soft thud clink, a new plate manifested on the right side of the table. The cutlery didn't just fall, it seemed to grow out of the wood. These pieces were even more distorted than the first. A knife lay there, its blade bent into a jagged zigzag, and 3 spoons that looked like curled fingernails. They weren't identical to the first set. Each guest had its own unique geometry. By the 6th night, I was terrified to eat because every time I lifted my fork, the static would spike in volume, and the voices would offer a critique of my movements. Too much pressure, they hissed. A delicate bite, but perhaps too slow. I found myself sitting in silence, watching the heap of cutlery grow. It was no longer just a few pieces. It was a sprawling collection of twisted metal. Each night, as I fell asleep, a new setting would materialize. There were chairs now that didn't have backs, just small stools made of fused spoons. And heavy, weighted plates. The table was becoming crowded with the bent silver. It looked like a forest of metal trees, their stems curving toward my face. On the 8th night, I stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like a centerpiece. The voices were no longer discussing me as an observer. They were describing my internal state. "The pulse is steady," they remarked. "The thought of us is making his skin prickle." I looked at the heap of cutlery in the center of the table. It had grown so large that it was a tangled mass of silver ribs and copper-toned curves. There were 12 settings now, each one distinct. Some spoons were twisted into perfect spirals. Some forks had tines so long they almost touched the rim of their plates. They weren't just objects anymore. When I moved my hand, the cutlery seemed to lean toward me, a collective tilt of metal heads. I reached out to touch the largest spoon, a massive, heavy thing that looked like a scoop of melted wax. As my fingers brushed the cool surface, the static reached a deafening crescendo, a roar of white noise that filled every crack in the shelter. "The feast begins," they whispered. I felt a sudden, sharp tug on my sleeve. I looked down to see a fork, one of the many bent pieces, reaching out from its plate. It didn't have a hand, but it moved with intent, its 4 curved tines wrapping around my wrist like a metallic claw. It wasn't just sitting there anymore. The cutlery was beginning to move independently of the table. They were crawling toward me, a slow-motion migration of silver and steel. A spoon slid across the wood with a dry hiss, followed by a knife that dragged its jagged edge like a crab leg. I tried to stand, but the voices erupted in a chaotic symphony of agreement. "Stay," they commanded. "The table is ready." One by one, the pieces began to climb onto my lap. They weren't heavy, but they felt purposeful. A spoon tucked itself under my chin. 3 forks fanned out behind my ears like a crown of thorns. The static settled into a low, contented purr, as if the room itself were satisfied with the arrangement. Then, the final setting appeared, the 13th one. It wasn't on the side of the table. It was directly in front of me, right where my own plate sat. It was a single, perfectly straight knife, its blade shimmering with a dull, matte finish. It didn't have a curve or a bend. It was the only piece of cutlery that looked normal. I reached for it, my breath hitching in my throat. I expected to grab the handle, but as my hand closed around it, the voices went completely silent. The static died instantly. For 3 seconds, there was absolute, vacuum-like silence. Then, the knife didn't wait for me to move it. It moved itself, slicing through the air with a sound like a sharpening stone against steel. It didn't cut my food, it sliced a thin line across my palm, and as the blood welled up, the heap of cutlery shuddered in unison. I realized then that they weren't just decorations or tools for eating. They were participants. The voices weren't just narrators. They were the hunger of the metal. I looked at the pile, and for the first time, I saw them move all at once, a wave of silver limbs reaching out to claim me. I sat there in the center of the shelter, my arm held firm by a dozen different forks, while the static began to rise again, this time sounding like 1,000 tiny teeth chewing. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories, and make sure to like.